Forgotten SBD crews of Guadalcanal found redemption on October 26, 1942, as Lieutenant Bernie Strong dove on the carrier Zuiho. Haunted by his failure to attack Ryujo in August, he held his dive through flak and released his bomb on target. The decision that had haunted him for weeks was finally put to rest. But the story of these forgotten crews began long before the Solomons, on a carrier in Hawaiian waters. The carrier Lexington steamed into Hawaiian waters on October 18, 1941. On her flight deck, a grounded pilot watched his fellow dive bomber pilots launch for shore leave, sidelined by an infected eardrum. He envied them, but none more than his best friend and roommate, Ensign John Lepla, who had promised to carry on for him if anything ever happened. 2 months later, on December 7th, Japanese carrier planes devastated Pearl Harbor. Lexington was at sea, and her scout planes scrambled to search for the enemy fleet. One lost pilot flew a desperate square search, while another broke radio silence to request help from Lexington's new radar. Both men landed safely by following the carrier's beam, but the squadron was not finished with its losses. On December 9th, the grounded pilot crashed into the ocean during a routine landing and was killed. Lepla wrote to the family, vowing to avenge his friend. "Robert's spirit is with you," the grieving mother wrote back. "Do your part and his also." 2 months later, on February 1st, 1942, the Navy struck back. The squadron skipper led his scouting 5 squadron from the carrier Yorktown in the first American offensive of the war. Their target was the Japanese-held island of Macon in the Gilbert Islands. 9 dive bombers pushed over from 12,000 feet. The skipper's bomb struck the seaplane tender Nagata Maru, and flames leaped 100 feet high. Pilot Stanley Vetasa, who had never seen combat before, fought a fogged windscreen and released his bomb by instinct. The SBD crews strafed 2 Kawanishi flying boats until both exploded. They returned to Yorktown bloodied but exhilarated. The weather had been foul and the losses stung, but the squadron had proven they could hit the enemy and come home. On March 10, 1942, the 2 carriers struck together. Lexington and Yorktown launched more than 100 planes against Japanese shipping at Lae and Salamaua on the coast of New Guinea. The Lexington Air Group commander guided the strikers through a 7,000-foot pass in the Owen Stanley Mountains. Below them lay a harbor full of enemy transports and warships. A squadron commander led his scouting 2 Dauntlesses down on the anchored ships, and Ensign John Lepla slammed a bomb into the transport Congo Maru. Pilot Stanley Vetasa, flying with Scouting 5 from Yorktown, released his bomb on a transport trying to flee, and his rear gunners strafed the decks as they pulled out. 4 Japanese ships were sunk and the cruiser Yubari was badly damaged. The raid proved the SBD could sink ships, but it also showed how difficult coordinated attacks between 2 carriers could be. The squadrons retired to replenish, knowing a larger battle was coming. By late April 1942, both carrier air groups were absorbing replacement pilots. Fresh ensigns from the Advanced Carrier Training Group arrived on Yorktown with brand new gold wings. Harold Buell, a young Iowan who had earned his private pilot's license in a Piper Cub, was among them. The veterans taught the rookies how to read the homing beacon, how to land on a pitching deck, and how to keep their nerve when the flak started. Task Force 17 refueled from the tanker Neosho and steamed south toward the Coral Sea. The pilots knew the Japanese were planning to invade Port Moresby, and the American carriers were the only force that could stop them. The SBD Dauntless had proven itself a rugged, reliable weapon. Now its crews would face the supreme test of carrier warfare. Lieutenant Commander William Birch led Scouting 5 off Yorktown's deck just after sunrise on May 4, 1942. Their target was the Japanese shipping massed in Tulagi Harbor just north of Guadalcanal. Each SBD Dauntless carried a 1,000-pound bomb, but as Birch pushed over into his dive, his inner windshield fogged over completely. He could not see the enemy ship through his sight. He stuck his head out the side of the cockpit and aimed by instinct alone. The same problem plagued Stanley Vetasa, who followed Birch down. Despite the fog, the dive bombers caught the Japanese completely by surprise. As Vetasa pulled out of his dive, a Japanese floatplane fighter latched onto his tail. His rear gunner, a young Cajun gunner named Lovelace Broussard, began shouting in French. Vetasa twisted his SBD into a series of scissor maneuvers. He finally got the floatplane in his sights and watched it fall away, trailing smoke. The first aerial victory for Scouting 5 was confirmed, but the day's results were mixed. Birch admitted to Admiral Fletcher that his squadron's bombing had been poor. The admiral sent them straight back to rearm and try again. By nightfall, the Yorktown Air Group had sunk the destroyer Kikuzuki and 3 small minesweepers, but everyone knew a bigger fight was coming. Enjoying the story? Subscribe to join us for the next one. The squadron spent the next 2 days steaming south through the Coral Sea. On the morning of May 7th, the scouts found what they were hunting. Lieutenant Commander Robert Dixon, leading Scouting 2 from Lexington, spotted the Japanese light carrier Shoho and her escorts. He radioed the position and held station while the strike force closed in. Commander Bill Ault led the Lexington group down first, and then Birch's Yorktown SBDs followed. Bomb after bomb crashed into Shoho's flight deck. Within minutes, the carrier was a blazing wreck. Dixon transmitted a single triumphant message back to the task force. Scratch one flat top. It was the first time an American pilot had sunk a Japanese carrier. But the fight was not one-sided. As the Yorktown SBDs pulled out of their dives, Zero swarmed them. Ensign John Jorgensen's SBD was hammered by anti-aircraft fire. His gunner, Tony Brunetti, saw a large hole rip open their left wing. Jorgensen was hit in the leg and lost power in his engine. He told Brunetti to help control the plane using the rear stick. The pair fought off 2 Zeros before Jorgensen ditched the crippled bomber near a destroyer. They were hauled aboard the Aylwin bleeding and exhausted. Jorgensen's leg wound was dressed on the destroyer's deck. Both men would live to fly again, but the carrier Shoho was gone forever. The Japanese invasion force turned back to Rabaul. The morning of May 8th began with both fleets searching for each other. A Lexington scout piloted by Lieutenant Joe Smith found the Japanese carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku at dawn. Birch organized Yorktown's strike group and led them toward the enemy. As he circled above the Japanese task force, he could see Shokaku's deck crawling with aircraft. He pushed over from 18,000 feet. Thick anti-aircraft fire burst all around his Dauntless. Birch's bomb missed, but the planes behind him pressed their attacks home. Lieutenant John Powers of Bombing 5 held his dive all the way down to 500 feet before releasing his 1,000-pounder. His bomb tore through Shokaku's flight deck. Powers and his gunner Everett Hill never pulled out of their dive. Both men were killed in the crash. Powers was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his sacrifice. The bomb damage to Shokaku was severe. She was forced to retire from the battle, burning and crippled. But the Japanese had already launched their own strike. 69 dive bombers, torpedo planes, and Zeros were heading straight for the American carriers. Lexington's radar picked them up at 50 miles. Admiral Fitch ordered all available planes into the air to intercept them. That included the dive bombers still on deck from the morning search. They were told to fly as fighters. The SBD Dauntless was not designed for dogfighting, but there was no choice. The pilots of Scouting 2 scrambled off the deck with only minutes to climb. Lieutenant Roy Hale was one of the first to engage. He attacked a group of Nakajima torpedo planes approaching Lexington's port side. Hale shot down 2 of them, but as he tried to land his damaged SBD, his own ship's gunners mistook him for the enemy. Anti-aircraft fire from the heavy cruiser New Orleans tore his plane apart. Hale and his gunner John Lackey crashed into the sea and were killed instantly. It was a brutal, senseless loss of 2 good men. The Japanese torpedo planes pressed on. 2 of their torpedoes slammed into Lexington's port side at 11:20 in the morning. The explosion shook the great carrier from bow to stern. Stanley Vetasa found himself in a fight that would last nearly 2 hours. 3 Zeros from Zuikaku singled him out and attacked in sequence. He threw his SBD into violent turns, firing his forward 50s whenever he caught an enemy in his sights. His gunner, Barton Wood, kept up a steady stream of fire from the rear cockpit. 1 Zero after another fell away trailing smoke. Vedtasa survived the battle with only minor wounds and was credited with shooting down at least one enemy fighter. Behind him, Birch's gunner Willard Glidewell was having his own fight. 3 Zeros attacked Birch's plane in rapid succession. Glidewell fired in short, careful bursts. He shot down all 3 of them. By early afternoon, the anti-aircraft patrols were over. Lexington was dead in the water, listing badly. Her crew abandoned ship throughout the afternoon. The destroyer Phelps put 5 torpedoes into her at dusk to send her to the bottom. Commander Bill Alt, the Lexington Air Group commander, never made it back. He had led the attack on Shokaku and scored a direct hit, but his plane was riddled with bullet holes and he was wounded. He radioed that he was out of fuel. Yorktown's fighter director told him to try for the nearest land. Alt replied, "So long, people. We got a 1,000-pound hit on the flat top." He was never heard from again. 216 of Lexington's crew went down with her. Scouting 2 surviving pilots were recovered by Yorktown. Ensign John Lepla had lost everything he owned. He climbed aboard Yorktown wearing only the clothes on his back, his naval aviator's ring, and his dog tag. He had claimed 4 aerial victories during the 2-day battle. All around him, the men of Bombing 2 and Scouting 2 stared at the burning glow on the horizon where their ship had been. The destroyers pulled survivors from the water for hours. Gunner Lawrence Kraft had retrieved a photo of his wife before abandoning ship. He was one of the lucky ones. The Japanese carriers turned north. They had lost Shoho and suffered heavy damage to Shokaku. The invasion of Port Moresby was canceled. The Battle of the Coral Sea was over. It had cost the United States a fleet carrier, a destroyer, and a tanker, but the surviving pilots had learned hard lessons. The SBD Dauntless dive bomber had proven its worth as a weapon against enemy carriers. The next fight would come sooner than any of them expected. After the Battle of the Coral Sea, Yorktown steamed to Tongatabu for temporary repairs, then to Pearl Harbor for full restoration. On May 30th, 1942, she sortied with a hastily repaired flight deck and a composite air group to meet the Japanese fleet approaching Midway Atoll. During the Battle of Midway on June 4th, dive bombers from Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet struck the Japanese carrier force. Yorktown's SBDs helped sink the carriers Akagi and Soryu, but later that day, Japanese dive bombers crippled Yorktown. She was abandoned on June 6th and finally sank on June 7th. Her surviving air group was absorbed by Enterprise and other units. The loss of Yorktown forced a reorganization of the surviving dive bomber squadrons. Men from Scouting 5 and Bombing 5, along with veterans of Lexington squadrons, were reassigned to Enterprise or sent to Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. The old squadron bonds dissolved, but the experience of combat at Coral Sea and Midway was carried forward. By early August, the Navy was ready to launch the first American ground offensive of the war. The objective was the Solomon Islands, specifically a tropical hell called Guadalcanal. New SBDs arrived fresh from the factory. Rookie pilots practiced dive bombing runs while veterans drilled them on proper release altitudes. Mechanics worked around the clock to keep every Dauntless operational. The stage was set for the invasion of Guadalcanal. On Guadalcanal itself, a dirt airstrip was being carved from the jungle by Japanese construction troops. The Navy code named it Cactus, and the men who would fly from it called themselves the Cactus Air Force. They had no carriers, no refrigerated food, and no safe place to sleep. What they had was a handful of SBDs, some Marine Wildcats, and a desperate determination to hold the field. It was from this muddy strip that the Cactus Air Force would make its stand. August 7, 1942, the 1st Marine Division hit the beaches of Guadalcanal and Tulagi before dawn. Carrier air groups from Enterprise, Saratoga, and Wasp provided cover, launching SBDs to bomb Japanese positions along the shoreline. Dive bombers struck the seaplane base at Tulagi, destroying fuel dumps and strafing troop concentrations. The Marines seized the unfinished airstrip by late afternoon and renamed it Henderson Field. The first foothold in the Solomons was secure. For the next 2 weeks, the SBD crews flew continuous close support missions. They bombed Japanese supply dumps, silenced artillery positions, and attacked shipping trying to reinforce the island. The Dauntless proved its worth as a precision weapon, putting 1,000-pound bombs within yards of friendly lines. On the ground, Marines learned to love the sound of an SBD's engine overhead. It meant the cavalry was coming with wings. On August 24th, the Japanese struck back with a carrier force built around the light carrier Ryujo. Admiral Fletcher's task force met them east of the Solomon Islands. SBDs from Enterprise located the Japanese flat top at midday and pushed over from 14,000 feet. Lieutenant Bernie Strong sighted Ryujo, but due to radio confusion and the pressure of the moment, was forced to turn back without attacking. The decision haunted him for weeks. Other SBDs pressed home their attacks, and several bombs struck home. The carrier erupted in flames and sank within hours. But the Japanese had launched their own strike against Enterprise. Enterprise took 3 bomb hits that afternoon. Fires raged in her hangar deck, and her flight deck was buckled by explosions. Several SBD crews were killed or wounded in the attack, and the deck was clogged with damaged aircraft. By nightfall, the Japanese had lost Ryujo, and their battleship force turned north. The beachhead at Guadalcanal was safe for another day. September 12, 1942. On Guadalcanal, the Japanese launched their most determined assault to retake Henderson Field. The objective was a low grassy ridge south of the airstrip, defended by elements of the 1st Marine Division. Known from that night forward as Bloody Ridge or Edson's Ridge, the position was thinly held and the Japanese attacked in overwhelming numbers. For the Marines dug into the muddy slope, the situation was desperate. At dawn on the 12th and again on the 13th, SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Henderson Field rose to meet the crisis. Flying under the call sign Cactus Air Force, these pilots delivered their bombs within yards of the Marine lines. They struck Japanese assembly areas, artillery positions, and troop columns moving through the jungle. Each pass bought the infantry precious minutes to reorganize and hold the line. The close air support proved decisive. The Japanese assault, though fanatical, could not overcome the combination of Marine tenacity and the relentless bombing from above. By the morning of September 14th, the ridge was still in American hands. The SBD crews had flown until their planes were riddled with holes and their bodies numb from exhaustion. Their bombs had broken the back of the Japanese offensive. 6 weeks later, on October 26th, the Imperial Japanese Navy made its own desperate play to crush the American foothold on Guadalcanal. The Battle of Santa Cruz Islands was joined north of the Solomons. On board the damaged but still fighting carrier Enterprise, Lieutenant Bernie Strong revved the engine of his SBD Dauntless. He had carried the burden of his failure to attack a Japanese carrier in August for weeks. This morning, he was determined to answer that doubt. Strong led his section into the gray, overcast sky as part of a search strike mission. His wingman, Ensign Chuck Irvine, a replacement pilot who had joined the squadron during the Guadalcanal buildup, tucked in close on his starboard side. At 14,000 feet, Strong spotted them through a break in the clouds, 2 Japanese carriers, Zuiho and Shokaku, their yellow flight decks drawing white wakes across the blue Pacific. He signaled Irvine and pushed the nose of his dive bomber over. The red rising sun circle on the Japanese flight deck grew in his windscreen as the altimeter unwound. His bomb release was clean and he pulled out hard. Strong's 1,000-pound bomb struck Zuiho's flight deck aft of the island. A plume of smoke and fire erupted from the carrier, silencing her flight operations for the remainder of the battle. Irvine, staying with his leader through the flak and fighters, also placed his bomb on the deck, though the weapon was a dud and failed to detonate. Strong recovered his SBD and set course for Enterprise. The criticism he had endured was gone. He had proven his nerve and his aim. While Strong attacked the carriers, other Enterprise SBD crews fought a running battle with Japanese Zeros. Lieutenant Stanley Vetaza, flying as a fighter pilot in his dive bomber, engaged a group of fighters that had latched onto the retiring American planes. He turned inside them, using the Dauntless's rugged construction to absorb damage while delivering his own fire. His gunner kept a steady stream of lead into the cockpit of 1-0, which rolled over and fell toward the sea. The Japanese counterstrike on the American task force was massive. The carrier Hornet, caught without adequate fighter cover, was hit by 3 bombs and 2 torpedoes. She burned through the afternoon and was abandoned, the first U.S. Fleet carrier lost since Lexington, Enterprise damaged again. Fought through the waves of Val dive bombers and Kate torpedo planes. Her flight deck was holed, but she remained operational. By nightfall, Enterprise was retiring south, her hangar bays filled with damaged SBDs and her crew counting their dead. Hornet was gone, but the Japanese carriers had been denied their victory. Strong's bomb had silenced Zuiho, and the damage to Shokaku kept her out of the fight for months. The SBD crews had paid a heavy price, but they had held the line over the island they called Hell's Island. The battle for Guadalcanal was far from over, but the carrier dive bombers had proven they could strike and survive. The carrier Enterprise arrived at Noumea in the final days of October. Her flight deck was scarred from the bomb hits she had taken at Santa Cruz. Yard workers and damage control parties began the slow process of repairs. The surviving dive bomber squadrons from 3 different carriers were consolidated into a single strike force. Fresh replacement pilots stepped off transport ships to fill the gaps left by the dead and wounded. The veterans rested and refitted while mechanics worked around the clock on the SBDs. The Japanese High Command was preparing one final offensive to recapture Guadalcanal. A powerful surface force of battleships and cruisers steamed south to bombard Henderson Field into rubble. Thousands of troops loaded onto transport ships ready to land once the airfield was silenced. On board Enterprise, the SBD crews studied their charts and waited for the order to launch. November 12th, Japanese battleships appeared off Guadalcanal in the pre-dawn darkness. Their big guns opened fire on Henderson Field, tearing up the runway and destroying parked aircraft. Marine and Navy dive bombers scrambled from the dirt strip between explosions. Enterprise, still under repair, launched her own strike group to join the fight. The SBDs pressed home repeated attacks against the heavily armored warships. The dive bombers focused on the battleship Hiei, a massive 40,000-ton vessel. Dauntlesses from Henderson Field and Enterprise dropped 1,000-pound bombs on her decks, shredding her anti-aircraft guns and wrecking her superstructure. Torpedo planes finished the job, flooding her steering room. Hiei circled helplessly through the night and was finished off by more air attacks at dawn. The Japanese bombardment force turned north, their mission to destroy Henderson Field a failure. On November 15th, the last Japanese troop convoy was caught in open water. SBDs from Henderson Field and Enterprise attacked wave after wave, joined by Army bombers and Navy Avenger torpedo planes. Transport ships burned and sank by the dozens. Thousands of Japanese soldiers drowned or were killed before they could reach the beach. The survivors of the Tokyo Express turned north for good. The campaign for Guadalcanal was effectively over. The surviving SBD crews gathered on Enterprise's hangar deck for a final roll call. The roll call was long, with many names met by silence. Among the missing was Ensign Tony Quigley, who had ditched his SBD in the Coral Sea, but weeks later word arrived that he had been rescued by Australian forces and returned to the United States. His combat flying days were over due to the injuries he had sustained. After the war, Scouting 5 Commander William Birch was killed in an aircraft accident on October 20, 1943, near San Diego. His death was a devastating blow to the dive bomber community, removing one of the most skilled tactical aviators of the early Pacific War. Scouting 5 pilot Stanley Vetasa continued in the Navy, earning command of a fighter squadron and retiring as a captain. Scout pilot Bernie Strong went on to a career in naval intelligence, retiring as a captain. Scouting 2 Commander Robert Dixon also served until retirement as a captain. Lexington Air Group Commander Bill Alt was never seen again after the Coral Sea, but the Navy honored him by naming Alt Field in his memory. Ensign John Lepless survived the war and returned to civilian life in Ohio. Chief Radio Man Willard Glidewell was discharged in 1945 and settled in Illinois. None of them ever forgot the names of the men who did not come home from Hell's Island. The legacy of the Dauntless crews was written in the simple fact that they had held on when holding on seemed impossible. And when the last roll was called on Guadalcanal, looking at the empty spaces in the formation, they could say they had done their duty. If you have family stories, personal memories, or historical accounts from the Pacific War or the Guadalcanal campaign, we would be honored if you shared them in the comments below. We read every one of them. If you would like to support more documentaries like this one, Please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. Thank you for listening and for keeping the memory of these airmen alive.